Witam Państwa po przerwie.
Welcome back after the break. We are meeting now with Mr. Andrzej Domagała, who is the graduate of the Department of Film Production Art Organization in Łódź, and he's interested in the topic of concentration camps and also other topics related to Second World War. And he's also the author of the book I Belong to the Average Evil People. That's the title. This book describes the group of German prisoners who appeared in Auschwitz 3 weeks before the first deportation of Polish transport, who they were, how they got to the camp, what happened with them after the war, and also how this book was created. All this will be described by Mr. Andrzej Domagała. Sir, the floor is yours. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hello.
Staram się tutaj udostępnić.
I'll try to make available the presentation. I hope it works.
O, dobrze. Szanowni Państwo,
Ladies and gentlemen,
charakterystykę więźnia,
the characteristics of a functionary prisoner was well presented by the previous speaker, and I would like to tell you a bit about this first 30 people, where this interest in this group of people came from. Many times this group was present in the memoirs and the memories of the former prisoners. One of the most characteristic descriptions were present in the letter in the book by Wanted by Kazimierz Albin, also books about political prisoners from Tarnów. Also Kazimierz Albin and Wiesław Kielar, both authors of these interesting books, mentioned that one of the first elements that drew their attention after the arrival to the camp, when still they did not know that this is a concentration camp they arrived at, there was a group of strange 30 men in dark blue jackets in like navy hats. Many times, even after the war, prisoners mentioned that they thought those were some Navy soldiers, and they greeted them in a very brutal way. Soon they realized this would also be, they were also prisoners, and they would be their future supervisors, German prisoners. And I was wondering whether any research was done regarding this. It turned out in 1974 there was a research done about this. Dr. Stanisław Koziński, who also was a former prisoner of Auschwitz, he played a very significant role there. Anyway, Dr. Koziński PhD, is the first page of this article we can see now. The role of German criminals in the beginnings of the Oświęcim camp, Auschwitz camp. He sent a letter to his colleagues, former prisoners, and asked them about any memories they had, memoirs connected with these 30 men, those German criminals, how they remembered them. Based on that, he created this article, and the task was difficult because in the 70s, research possibilities were much more limited than they are today, because, for example, there was no internet, so he had to base only on those memories that were sent to him, plus also the camp documentation. But the camp documentation was maintained in a very limited part, only single records in some bunker books, in some hospital words. Many times they included some errors in the names, in the surnames, in the place and date of birth, incorrect. So I decided that perhaps now, having at our disposal a research tool such as the internet, maybe it would be possible to somehow fill up these gaps in the knowledge. That was my assumption. Here we can see the first prisoner, Dr. Setkiewicz mentioned, prisoner number 1. This is senior of the camp, the most important person in the prisoner hierarchy. And he is a very characteristic person because He was very brutal. And generally speaking, he was remembered by the prisoners in a very bad way. Anyway, I managed also to find information about him. Reports, maybe not very positive, but still proving that he was not always that very brutal. A curiosity fact, he came from Poznań city. He could speak Polish very well, and he had a kind of sentimental pose, which they sometimes used. They were able to, let's say, solve some matters, get something from him. It was a professional criminal. Before the war, he was punished for thefts and burglaries that he performed with his brother. Even we have in the Berliner Zeitung an article about this, the one that we see now, in which it's mentioned, there is mention about Stefan Brodniewicz, so the brother of Bruno, with whom together they performed burglaries, and even we have information how in Berlin they were both caught in an apartment that Bruno then also used his true name, so Bolesław, and how in his flat many furs were found from a burglary to a luxury clothes shop in Wrocław. So it's typical. Bruno Brodniewicz was a senior of the camp until the year 42, when he was the victim of a provocation of several prisoners who escaped from the camp in 42. Simply, they left a letter in which they informed that Bruno Brodniewicz is forwarding some valuables, keeping some valuables in his room. Those valuables were found there, actually, in his room at the camp, and he was degraded. He was sent to the bunker in the camp prison, and there his power, you could say, started fading. He left the bunker after 3 months, but never he regained his former position in the hierarchy of the camp. Even in the next slide, we can see that in the year 45, he was transferred to the Mittelbolder camp. And here we can even see the camp number, so six-digit number, which shows that he was no longer the prisoner number 1, but he was one of the many other prisoners with a 6-digit high number, which was not that respectful anymore as earlier number 1 he had. So his person is characteristic and interesting because for a long time it was believed that Bruno Brodniewicz, after the liberation of Bergen-Belsen camp, where he was at the end of the war, that he was beaten up, but the story was different. He simply, after the liberation of his camp, he left to Brera and there died in 62. So even as far as I know, he was also wanted after the war twice. Once prosecutor's office in Munich, one in Frankfurt, but due to some reasons he was never caught actually. So he did not face any responsibility after the war for his acts, cruelties in Auschwitz. He was not punished. And it's one of the largest, one of the most interesting facts I found in the documentation. For a long time I was convinced that it was probable that prisoners simply, after the war, killed him because he, as I remember, as I've said, mentioned, he was had a very infamous name of being very cruel. Here in the side we see another prisoners, number 22, August Miller, and he was also belonged to one of the most brutal prisoners among these first 30 German criminals. He also is very characteristic, and because it was assumed that he died after the war, during the war, in military actions, because he acted as a volunteer to the German military army when it was announced that criminals can become volunteers in the army. There he applied, and it turns out that indeed, in the reality, after the war, he came back from Russian slavery, and soon after the war he committed suicide. So it's also a typical special thing, which shows that many times such theories of former prisoners about what happened with those functionary prisoners were not true.
zupełnie
What the
inaczej.
prisoners were believed, their
Na
stories were
drugim
completely different.
slajdzie
In the
widzimy
next
Erysia
slide, you can
Grenkę.
see
To jest
Erich
przypadek
Grenke. It's a
charakterystyczny,
case
ponieważ świadczy o tym, że
specific
ci
because it
więźniowie
proves that these
funkcyjni
functionary
też z
prisoners
czasem
also over time
no, gdzieś tam mogli się z tymi
somewhere
władzami
were able
zaprzyjaźnić,
to
prawda? Przytaczam ten
become
przykład
friends
dlatego,
with the
że Erich
authorities
Grenke był
because Erich Gremche
przyjaźniony z
was
komendantem Rudolfem Hessem.
had good relationships with
Jako kierownik warsztatów
Commissioner
obozowych
Rudolf Hess.
świadczył tam
As the manager of
dosyć
camp
różne
workshops, he provided
usługi
many
jako
services to
sprawcy z
Hess.
jego łaski,
He gained
a
his
potem
sympathy, and
został z obozów
then
pod koniec
he was,
1941 roku
in the
zwolniony.
end of 1941, released from the camp. And
Prawdopodobnie gdzieś tam
probably Rudolf Hess
się do tego przyczynił. W
contributed
każdym
to
razie po
that.
zwolnieniu
Anyway, he
Erich
allowed,
Gremke,
after
którego tutaj
being
widzimy
released,
w
Erich
obozowej
Gremke, who we
uniformie,
see here in the camp
chodził
uniform,
w eleganckim
he
w
wore
eleganckim ubraniu, w
elegant
tyrolskim
clothes,
kapelusiku, jeździł sobie bryczką
Tyrol
i był
hat,
dyrektorem
riding a
właśnie tych
horse
warsztatów odzieżowych,
wagon, and he
a
was the
później fabryki
director of the
skóry. Nawet była
clothes
taka anegdota,
company, and
że
even leather
dzieci
factory.
Rudolfa
There was
Hessa
even
nie
an
chcą
anecdote
położyć
that
się
the
spać,
children of
dopóki
Rudolf
wujek
Hess don't
Erich,
want to
czyli Erich
go to
Gremke, nie
sleep
powie im gute
before
Nacht dobranoc.
Uncle Harish
Także
doesn't
to
tell them
jest
gute Nacht.
przypadek
So
dosyć
it's a case that's quite specific.
charakterystyczny.
He was friends with
Postacią
Hess.
taką
Another person
dosyć
that's
też
quite
znaną
also
wśród tych reakcyjnych
renowned
więźniów
among
jest
these
widoczny tutaj
in the
Hans von
and
Ziegler.
present
To
in
jest
the memories of
postać o
former
tyle
prisoners. Hans von
charakterystyczna, że
Ziegrund
on
is specific
zdecydowanie
person
odbiegał
because he
pod względem manier
was
reszty
in terms of his
więźniów
manners,
funkcyjnych.
he was
Nie tak
different than other
był
functionary
człowiek dość
prisoners. It was
inteligentny,
quite an intelligent
był dobrze
person,
wychowany, ale
quite well
jednocześnie był człowiekiem bardzo brutalnym.
educated, but he was very brutal
Tutaj
also.
też jest o
And
tyle to
here
charakterystyczne, że
it's
przypadek jego
specific that
pokazuje,
his
że
case shows that
stanowisko więźnia funkcyjnego
the
no,
position of a
jednak
functionary prisoner
nie czyniło takiego
does not
człowieka
make such a person
no, zupełnie, że tak powiem, bezpiecznym,
completely
ponieważ
safe,
można było popaść w
because
niełaskę
you could
i to stanowisko
lose
stracić.
favor and
Tak
lose
też
this
się
position.
stało
This is
tutaj
what
właśnie w
happened
tym
here
wypadku,
in his case,
ponieważ Hans von
because
Ziegert
Hans von
w
Ziegrund
pewnym momencie
at a certain moment
został dopisany do
was added to
transportu
the
ludzi chorych i
transport
łom
of people
i
who are
zostali
sick, who
wywiezieni
were
do
sent to
Pirny i tam
Pirna, and
zgładzeni
they're killed
w prowizorycznej komorze
in
gazowej.
a gas chamber.
Prawdopodobnie stało się tak
And
dlatego,
probably
że
this happened because
gdzieś tam jakieś przechowywał złoto,
he kept gold,
też, że
or that
nie
he
był posłuszny wobec
was not
SS-manów. No, są różne
obedient to
wersje,
the assessment. There are
dlaczego
various
do tego
stories about
doszło.
why this happened. Anyway,
W każdym razie stanowisko
anyway,
utracił
he lost his position and
i
was
zginął.
killed in the
Kolejną
gas chamber. Another
postacią, której
person,
też
which
taki,
also
która też świadczy o tym
also
właśnie, że
this
stanowisko
proves that the position of a
więźnia funkcyjnego to
functionary
przed
prisoner
wszystkim jednak nie
is
chroniło.
not
To jest
permanent,
Leo
doesn't
Wieczorek,
protect you from
tutaj
anything. Is
widoczny.
Leo Wieczorek, which you can see here.
Więzień
And
niezwykle
he is a
brutalny,
prisoner that was very
o których
brutal,
relacje właściwie
that
żadne pozytywne się nie zachowały.
no positive comments about
Jest ich
him
bardzo wiele i wszystkie
are
świadczą o tym, że to był człowiek
present. There
no,
are
bez
a lot
żadnych
of
właściwie
comments speaking that he was
wyższych
very,
uczuć,
very
który
cruel, without any superior feelings, who
bardzo
was
brutalnie traktował
very
tych
brutally
więźniów,
treated these prisoners,
bardzo wielu
and
zamordował.
many of them,
W
a lot
każdym
of them
razie
killed. He killed.
tutaj
And here,
historia ma się
the
nieco inaczej,
story
to znaczy
is
on
a bit
zginął z rąk
different. He
więźniów.
died
Więźniowie,
killed
którzy go
by prisoners, so
nienawidzili,
prisoners who
przywrócili mu
hated him
sweter z wszami tyfusowymi, on
sent
zaraził
him
się
a
tyfusem, no i oni
sweater
już
with
wówczas dopilnowali, żeby ten Leo Wieczorek się z
bacteria
tego
disease,
nie wyleczył. Z
and
tym, że to
then he just
rzeczywiście
didn't
jest
get
rok
healed.
42, kiedy już
It's the
więźniowie
year
nawiązali
42
jakiś ruch oporu i potrafili
when
się
the
więźniom może trochę bardziej
prisoners
przeciwstawić niż
had a
początkowo
resistant
w
movement.
okresie
They simply
istnienia
infected him with typhus
obozu.
because of a sweater.
To było
He
kilku
died.
więźniów, którzy
There was a
byli
group of
bardzo
several
brutalni
prisoners who
i
established a
w pewnym sensie
resistance
przez
movement. They were very brutal,
ludzi tego typu uznało
and
się, że
because of
właśnie
such
słowo kapo to
people,
jest synonim osoby brutalnej
the word capo
i że na
remained
pewno on był
remembered
osobą
as
bardzo
someone very
brutalną, przy
brutal.
czym to nie
For
do
sure, he
końca
was a very brutal person, but this
tak
is not
było,
completely the story
ponieważ
because
byli więźniowie
there were
zupełnie
also prisoners
odmienni
who were
więźniowie
different,
funkcyjni. Tutaj
functionary
ten
prisoners
Otto
who were
Kyzel,
not that
którego
bad. Here
pan
he's an
doktor
Otto
Setkiewicz
Kyzel,
przywołał
who Mr.
wcześniej.
Dr. Setkiewicz mentioned
To
already.
jest postać,
This is a person who,
tak jak właśnie mój poprzednik powiedział,
as my previous speaker mentioned,
zupełnie pozytywna.
completely positive. He
Nawet
was a positive
muszę
person.
powiedzieć, że
I have to
przeglądając
say that
te
even looking
relacje
through the reports in the books, in the camp archive, the reports of former prisoners where Otto Hizel is mentioned, perhaps I was thinking that perhaps there may be some report that he was not always so honest, because he was helpful. He was honest. All the reports about this prison, this functionary prisoner, are very positive about this person. Good, helpful. He played a very important function because, as was mentioned by the previous speaker, he was the one assigning work to prisoners, and a lot of them he could do a lot of good this way, and a lot of prisoners survived thanks to him. It's also specific that even in the archive in Bad Arolsen, we have letters in which prisoners arrive at emigration after the war, searched for Otto Hazel and asking for help in finding him, because they remember that his name was Otto, number 2, and he was very helpful. And clearly speaking, this person saved my life, and I want to thank him somehow. And this, fortunately, in several cases happened. And yes, the prisoners after the war established contact with him and thanked him. So Otto Kiesel is a person that's specific because before the war, he was a person who was not really a good example before the war. He used to stray on the streets of Berlin, some dark streets with some dark company, and quite he committed thefts, burglaries. Here we can before the war. Here we can see one of the court sentences: 1 year, 3 months of imprisonment. This was not the first of his sentences. And Otto Kiesel also mentioned after the war that he regretted the way he used to live before the war. He wanted to sort of redeem his guilds, and as most of his colleagues from the first 30 functionary prisoners was very brutal, he was very helpful indeed. And never did it happen that he would hit anyone just because of being brutal. Also, a report has been maintained that he hit some prisoner in the face, but it turned out that this way he protected him from an SS man who, for sure, would be more brutal towards this prisoner, whereas this way Otto saved his life because he hit this prisoner in the face and ordered him to go back to the block. The SS man was surprised that Otto, who is such a good person, hit somebody, and this prisoner that was by him beaten in the face was grateful, and that he protected him again Ottoman and SS man. And Otto Hizel asked for a piece of sausage and bread. He gave it to this prisoner, said he was sorry. That was specific special person among these 30 functionary prisoners. And of course, there also happened, even besides Otto Kiesel, there were also people who were quite positively remembered. Such a person was, for example, Johnny Lisienich, whom we see here. It's a photograph from prison in Brewa, because his camp photograph was not maintained. There are not that many reports about this Johnny as much as we have about Otto Kiesel, and there are some reports which say that indeed he was brutal. He was not such a perfect person, but the most of the reports anyway are positive about him, about Johnny. And he also is an interesting person because Johnny Lehenich became friends with Polish prisoners, and in October 1942 he escaped with 2 Polish prisoners. After the escape, he joined the National Army. So even I came across opinions that this is, after all, this is a story for a film scenario, for a good film scenario, his story. And here we can see also lists of sentences of Willy Meyer. Why am I showing
Dlaczego tutaj
this?
poruszam ten temat?
Why am I
Ponieważ
mentioning this topic? Because
tutaj jest
here we have
charakterystyczne
specific
powody, dla których tych
reasons
więźnionych
why
trafili
these
w ogóle do
prisoners at all
obozu
were
koncentracyjnego.
ended up in the concentration
Tutaj
camp.
widzimy, że lista
Here we can
wniosków,
see that
która
the
wobec Williego
list
Mayera
of
przed więźnia
sentences of
numer
Willie Mayer,
20,
so
no
prisoner
to jest
number
13
20,
zarzutów.
is
Także to
13
też
accusations. So it's also
pokazuje, że to byli
shows
więźniowie po
that these
prostu
were
wielokrotnie
prisoners
karani.
who were punished many
Utarła się
times.
taka
And
opinia,
even an
że
opinion was
ci
established that
więźniowie
those
przed wojną byli
prisoners
karani za
before the
okrutne
war were
morderstwa
punished
i
for
jakieś tam
cruel
straszne rzeczy.
murders and
I
cruel
rzeczywiście to jest w
acts.
pewnym sensie
In
uzasadnione,
some
ponieważ
sense,
niektórzy
somehow this
więźniowie,
is
widząc to,
justified because some
co
of the
ci więźniowie
prisoners,
funkcyjni, a Czechosłowakowie
seeing what these
robią po
functionary
wojnie jako
prisoners
list
do in
strasznych,
the
traktują
camp,
tych swoich podwładnych,
how cruel they are
no
to
to z
their
całą pewnością jest
subordinates, for
podyktowane
sure
jakąś tam
it results from
straszną,
some
zbrodniczą przeszłością.
horrible past.
Tymczasem to jest
Whereas it's
zupełnie nieprawda,
completely
ponieważ
not
te
true, because
przestępstwa były
these crimes you
przestępstwami
can see here
wojennymi,
were
przy czym
small
było ich
crimes,
na
petty
ogół
crimes, and
dużo. Tutaj na
there
przykład
was a lot of them, but they were petty crimes. For
widzimy, że
example, we can see here
wykazie, że
in this
zarzuty
list
dużo
that
z tych
there are many
przestępstwa
crimes, many
to
accusations,
jest oszustwo,
but it's like
kłamanie, sprzeniewierzenie,
cheating, theft,
jakieś
burglary,
tam posługiwanie się
forfeiture
fałszywymi
of money,
kancelaриami, także to tego
using
typu
false personal data, these
raczej
kind of petty
przestępstwa
crimes, not serious
były
ones he
niż
committed,
jakieś tam
not, I would say,
zbrodnie typu
serious
morderstwo.
crimes like murder,
Nawet muszę powiedzieć, że
more like
prowadząc tę
offenses here.
dokumentację,
And the document
dotarłem
keeper,
do wielu
the
tych
record
akt
keeper,
policyjnych
I
z
reached
właściwie
many
tej
police
pierwszej
records
trzydziestki i
regarding the
nigdzie nie
first
ma mowy,
30
by którykolwiek z
prisoners,
tych więźniów był
and none
skazany
of
za
those
morderstwo.
prisoners
Zresztą gdyby
was
tak rzeczywiście było, to
punished for
raczej nie
murder.
trafiłby
If
do
that
obozu
would be the case, he
koncentracyjnego,
would not
tylko
have been
do
sent to a
zakładu karnego,
concentration camp, but
prawdopodobnie by
to a
został stracony.
prison in
A tutaj
Germany and
mamy
would be killed. And here
sytuację
we have a
zupełnie
situation that was completely
inną.
different. And
Zresztą osoba Willego Mayera też
the
jest
Willie Mayer is
tyle
also an
ciekawa, dlatego
interesting
tutaj
person
właśnie
whom
sobie go
here
wyszczeliśmy,
I've mentioned,
że był to
because
więzień do
it
tej
was a
pory właściwie
prisoner
taka
that
postać
until now
enigmatyczna.
he
Niewiele
was
o nim
quite
było
enigmatic. We didn't know much
wiadomo.
about him.
On
And
zresztą
he,
w Auschwitz nie przebywał zbyt
in
długo,
Auschwitz, he
ponieważ
didn't stay for
szybko
very
dosyć
long because
zbiegł.
quickly he escaped.
A dlaczego
And
jego postać
why?
jest
He is
charakterystyczna?
interesting and
Ponieważ
specific because
okazało się,
it turned
że go
out that
zatrzymano już
he
kilka
was
miesięcy po ucieczce,
arrested just
ale
a few
że
months
był to
after he
człowiek
escaped, but this was a person who
bardzo
was very
sprytny i w moim
clever,
przekonaniu też
and
bardzo
I believe
inteligentny,
also
to
very
on jakoś
intelligent. He somehow
zawsze gdzieś umiał się z kłopotów
always was able to
wywinąć,
get out
kiedy go
of
przewożono
trouble
już do
when he was
Auschwitz z
transported to
powrotem
Auschwitz, back
w
to
roku
Auschwitz
1942,
in
to
the year
gdzieś tam po
42.
drodze
He, on the
sobie tylko
way,
wiadomym sposobem
only he knew
zbiegł i
how
już tym razem przepadł
escaped,
na
and this time
kilka
his
lat.
escape was
Ostatecznie
successful
też
for a few years. Finally,
znaleziono go
also, they
dopiero pod
found him
koniec
only at the end of the
44 roku
year
i
44,
gdzieś
and
tam
mm,
bodajże w październiku
perhaps in
44 roku
October
już go
44,
przywieźli
he
do
was
obozu. No w
transported to
dawnych
the camp.
latach to już
And back in
w tych
those
wcześniejszych
years,
latach raczej
in the
zostałby od
earlier
razu
years, he would have
stracony.
been immediately killed.
A tutaj
But
to już
here,
był
it was
końcowy okres
the end
funkcjonowania obozu,
period of the
więc jakoś
functioning
mu
of the
się
camp, so
jednak
somehow he
udało,
managed
został po
to
prostu karnie przeniesiony do
survive. He was
innego
just
obozu i tam
transferred to a
doczekał
different camp,
wyzwolenia.
and there
Tu
he
jeszcze widzimy
mm,
list gończy, który za nim
stayed until the
wydano w
liberation. He
listopadzie
received a
1940
wanted
roku.
letter in
Nawet jest
November
charakterystyczne
1940 with
wpisy,
specific
opis
descriptions
jego,
of his
jego rysopis, w którym nawet
looks
wspomina się o jakichś
that mentions
okaleczeniach
some
więziennych.
scars, prison
Także
wounds.
świadczy to o tym, że
So
on
this
przed wojną
proves that
rzeczywiście dosyć
before the war,
dużo
indeed,
czasu
he
spędził w zakładach
spent
karnych
quite a
i
lot of time in
miał
prisons,
bogatą
and he had
historię kryminalną.
a lot of criminal past, you could say.
Kolejna rzecz,
Another thing
która
is,
jest
which is also
dosyć istotnym aspektem
quite significant
wśród
aspect
tych właśnie
among
więźniów funkcyjnych,
these functionary
zresztą dotyczy
prisoners, it
bardzo wielu
refers
niemieckich
to a lot
więźniów
of
funkcyjnych,
German
to jest
functionary prisoners, is
służba wojskowa w Sonderkommando
military
i
service in
Lewange. Tutaj
Sonderkommando
widzimy
der Lewange. Here we see
kartę
the
z ewidencji
data
wojskowej,
sheet from the
która
military
należała do
records,
Arno Böhma,
which belong to Arano
więźnia numer 8.
Böhm,
Zresztą w
prisoner
dawnych,
number 8, in
początkowym
the former
okresie
initial
istnienia
period of
obozu.
the existence of the camp.
To był
This
osobisty
was
fryzjer
a
komendanta
personal
Rudolfa Hessa.
hairdresser of
To
Commissioner
dosyć
Rudolf Hess, Commander Rudolf Hess, so it was
charakterystyczne. W
specific
każdym
characteristic.
razie
And
Arno
anyway,
Böhm był jednym z
he was
więźniów,
one of
którzy
the
zostali właśnie
prisoners who
zwolnieni z
were
obozu. I
released
przesługują
from the
to
camp.
zwolnienie
This
właściwie
was a
czysto
release purely, you
teoretyczne,
could say,
ponieważ
theoretical,
tak
because
naprawdę on tylko
actually
parkat
he only,
niestety uniform obozowy
let's say, he
zamienił na
changed
wojskowy
his
mundur, a w
striped
rzeczywistości
uniform, camp
ci kilku
uniform, to
jego
a
kolegów,
military
którzy także
uniform, and a few
zostali
of his
też służbą
colleagues were
wojskowej
also
zwolnieni,
released from the camp. he still remained under the jurisdiction of the SS. So here another military sheet is also Wident Jansen, so former capo of number 14. He, as the only one of this group, died during the war because their 5 prisoners were included into this military unit Oskartylewangers, but only one of them died during the military operations. Here you can see the description. He died on the 14th of September 44 in Tworki. It's Pruszków near Warsaw. So it's another specific aspect. It's specific that those prisoners, after the war, when they gave testimonies in Frankfurt am Main in court hearings, in Oświęcim hearings, they were not really willing to reveal that they were having this service.
They would use like a statement that they was in a kind of like assessment unit, let's say. They didn't want to use names, his name specifically, because after the war, it was not the reason to be proud of, that they actually served in this unit. So another important subject that people asked me about was the responsibility, penal, criminal responsibility of these people after the war. Not many of them actually were before court, they went to court. And actually, that's one example. Bulk Arthur, he was stopped by the American military tribunal. Even the Polish side wanted to make this extradition. But there were a lot of prisoners as witnesses who actually gave him a sort of recommendation, they evaluated him as a good person. He had a kind of positive opinion. Even Witold Pilecki would say positive things about him, and he was, freed. But there were also other cases like Bonnet, number 6, and he was very quickly arrested after the war. It regarded different issues, basically, and in different camps. He did a lot of things, bad things, even before the Auschwitz concentration camp. But he was kind of lucky because one of the major prisoners actually committed a suicide. So, actually, the proceedings, the court proceedings, actually were, I would say, enabled. So they were. The situation was that it was discontinued. But after some time, again, he was actually brought before court. And this time, he was actually charged to prison. And it happened, I think, in 1967 or 68. So very late. It was a life sentence, basically, but it was very, very late. In 1971, he died. So actually, he spent in prison like several years, and he died. Elich Grenke, and he was supposed to be judged in the same proceedings, but he was excluded from these proceedings because of his health condition, and his case was supposed to be adjudicated later, but he died eventually, so no penalty was imposed on him, basically, because he died. So the proceedings, of course, after his death were discontinued as well. So another prison that, again, was brought before court, was arrested by some institutions. He was Paul Szykowski with number 27 from Silesia region. The opinions about him were all of them were very negative. Prisoners would say that he was scary, that he they would, feel so much
w
fear when they saw
1942
him.
roku
And in
zwolniony z
1942,
obozu,
he was actually freed
a
from the camp.
przypomnę w 1945 roku zaraz
And
po
in
wojnie w ogóle wpuszczono
1945,
go
just
wcześniej
after the
chciał podjąć
war,
pracę
he
w
actually went
Gliwicach,
to some workplace,
ponieważ chciał się tam
some
zatrudnić,
facility in
ale więzień,
Gliwice
który tam
city.
pracował, były
But the
więźnie, no
prisoner,
poznał go szybko,
the
zawiadomił
former prisoner
policję
recognized
i
him
Urząd
because he was
Bezpieczeństwa,
working
bo w
there.
45
And of
jeszcze
course, in
istniał Urząd
1945,
Bezpieczeństwa.
there was this,
I on został
security
od razu
office that
aresztowany. Tutaj
actually
widzimy
arrested
protokół
him just
jego
right away. And here you can see the
przesłuchania.
report from
On
this
zresztą był zapytany przez
interrogation.
oficera
And he was
śledczego,
asked
dlaczego
by the
on
officer,
bił tych
why did you
podległych
beat all this,
więźniów. To
prisoners?
odpowiadał mniej więcej
He
tak,
would
że
say, well,
biłem, bo mi
I
nakazywało
was beating
SS, a
them
podli
because
więźniowie nie
SS
chcieli
men
pracować.
told me to
Także
do that. And actually,
tak
they
on się
didn't want to
spokojnie
work. So I had to beat them,
tłumaczył.
That was his
W każdym
explanation.
razie
And during this
no, to jest
interrogation
jedna z niewielu
proceedings,
osób,
but
które
that's one of
po
the
wojnie
very few
stanęły
people who actually,
przed sądem.
were
Inna
brought
sprawa,
before
że
court.
wielu z tych więźniów
And
to
many of these
jednak, nawet gdyby
prisoners,
po wojnie
even
stanęli przed
if
sądem,
they
to
would
raczej
have been
nie
brought
skończyłoby się
before
to jakimiś
court after
bardzo
the war,
krótkimi
I don't
wyrokami.
think there
Podejrzewam,
will
że
be
to
very
byłoby czasem
high
parę lat za
punishments,
jakieś tam
perhaps several years for
brutalne
some
postępowanie.
brutal
Szanowni Państwo,
treatment. Well, ladies
istotną
and gentlemen,
rzeczą
it
tutaj
is important
na
to
przykładzie
note
30
here on the
to są
example
przede
of this
wszystkim
functionary prisoner is to
mity
mention
o tych funkcyjnych, to znaczy oczywiście utarła
myths
się taka
about
opinia,
this
że
functionary prisoners because
to była
they would
grupa
say
30
that
osób,
that was a group
wśród
of
których
30
tylko ten
people,
Uncle
among
Fizzle, który był taki
whom
bardzo
only Uncle Fizzle, who
wyjątkowo
was very
pomocny w stosunku do więźniów
helpful.
Polaków.
So except him, that
Że
was a group
poza
of
nimi
30
wszyscy
people,
byli
and they
takimi
were
bezwolnymi
all
narzędziami w rękach
like
SS i
tools in
oni
the
tylko
hands of
bili,
SS, and they would
mordowali
murder, beat
i
people,
nic
and
nie można było się
whip
spodziewać od nich
people.
dobrego.
Nothing
W
good
rzeczywistości to
happened,
jednak
in reality.
sprawa jest o
Well,
wiele bardziej złożona,
it
a
was a
tego
very
tego świadczą
complex
właśnie
issue because
relacje byłych
you can see
więźniów.
the
No to
reports of the former
takie
prisoners that
najbardziej
would say that
charakterystyczne
it
relacje to
was
są
not
zawarte właśnie w listach,
only
które
this,
byli
because you can see
więźniowie
it in the letters
wysłali do doktora
mm,
Stanisława Chłodzińskiego. Tych listów
to
jest
Stanisław
bardzo
Płodziński.
wiele
There were many of
i
such
są to
letters.
listy
There
bardzo
are many,
różne.
and they are different. The
Tutaj
contents is very different.
generalnie oczywiście
Of
wspomniany
course,
Bruno
in
Podniewicz,
general,
Leo
Bruno
Wieczorek, to
Podniewicz, Leo
ich
Wieczorek, or
relacje są
their reports
właściwie wyłącznie złe.
are very negative,
Natomiast
yes,
zdarzało
but
się
there were some
wielokrotnie, że
letters that would
więźniowie
show, some
oceniani byli
information that,
zupełnie
some
przyzwoicie,
prisoners
tak jak na
would
przykład
not give
Optofiezel
such
albo
negative opinions like
Andrzej
Optofisl or
Zresztą
John
znalazło się
Rifjecik
kilku,
or
wobec których
some
te
other
relacje
prisoners,
były
like functionary
zupełnie
prisoners
niezłe.
against whom
A
these
zdarzało
reports
się,
were
że
not so
więźniowie
negative.
sądzali, że
However,
właściwie
some
ten czy
prisoners would
tamten
say that
funkcyjny
this or that
właściwie to byli
functionary
ludzie
prisoner, well, they
w
were
zasadzie zupełnie bierni, że
very
no oni coś
passive
tam pili,
people. They
coś
would
tam
beat,
może
they would
czasami
maybe
można było od nich
sometimes
oberwać, ale że generalnie
beat
to się
you, but in
jakoś
general, they would be kind of
szczególnie nie
passive.
znęcali, czasami
They
coś tam
wouldn't be
nawet się
very
mogli, ale
brutal.
że generalnie byli
Sometimes
to
they would
ludzie
even help,
bierni,
but
którym
they were
ci
like passive
podlegli
people,
więźniowie to właściwie byli obojętni.
and
Oni
they were kind of
specjalnie nie pomagali
indifferent.
ani im
They wouldn't help, or they wouldn't
nie
beat you, or they
szkodzili.
wouldn't whip you,
Ale
So
charakterystyczne
just,
jest również to, że
indifferent.
jeden
But what else?
funkcyjny mógł być przez
One
poszczególnych
functional
tych
prisoner
więźniów oceniany
could
bardzo różnie.
have
Tak jest na
been
przykład
evaluated differently by different
przykład Halsa
prisoners,
Pocha,
obviously, like
więzień numer
Halsbach
5, który był
and prisoner
taką
number
postacią
5,
kontrowersyjną. Tu
who was a very
wielu więźniów
controversial
wspominało, że
figure.
on
Many prisoners would say
jako
that him as
szef
a
obozowego szpitala bardzo wielu
head of the hospital
więźniom
camp,
pomógł,
he would help many
a
prisoners
inni z kolei
back
mówili, że
then,
jednak bardzo
and others
sprywatyzował
would
tym
say
władzom
no, he would
obozowym i
use,
wielokrotnie byli świadkami, jak
prisoners,
on
and
wielu więźniów
they would see
zamordował
that he would
zastrzyków fenolem.
murder
Także
a
to
lot of
jest
prisoners with the phenol
też właśnie rzecz charakterystyczna.
injections. And so he would murder people, actually. So
Mówili na
there are different
przykład
opinions
też i o
among these
innych
prisoners,
więźniach,
and
że
also the same about other
wielokrotnie pomagali, a z
functionaries,
kolei
that
inni
they
mówili
would
o tym samym
help,
więźniu, że
other
podczas
would say
lekcji
that
śpiewał,
no, they
wchodził z
wouldn't
pałą
help, they would beat
i tych
people,
więźniów
especially
bił,
during music
więc
lessons, for example,
czasami
during
jest
singing. So,
trudno to
sometimes it's
jednoznacznie
hard to
ocenić,
determine that because you can
jaka
have
rola była
contradictory opinions
tego
of,
człowieka
against the same people,
w
the same
obozie. W każdym
functionary
razie no jest to
prisoners.
bardzo złożone. To
So
dotyczy
it's a
zresztą
complex
wszystkich
subject,
więźniów funkcyjnych,
obviously.
wszystkich tych transportów.
And also the
Mówimy o tym transporcie
transportation issue.
osobowym tych
When there was this
więźniów
100 people
funkcyjnych w ارل
transportation,
Sachsenhausen
functional
też zdarzały się
prisoners
osoby
transportation,
różne,
there were
osoby
different
bardzo dobrze
people among them.
postrzegane
There were
i
some that were perceived well, and there were some that
postrzegane
were
bardzo,
perceived bad.
bardzo źle.
badly. So, ladies and gentlemen, just a few words about the creation of this book, because it's quite interesting, you know. Of course, I started my search from International Trade Services, but Arosen, which actually saved a lot of documents from concentration camps, also post-war documents by prisoners who actually went there for some information. And there, I managed to get a lot of documents. However, at certain point, these were mainly letters of newly coming influence from Buchenwald, Auschwitz, you know. Sometimes these documents didn't really give me a lot information, and you can say that I stopped, you know, at certain point, and I couldn't move. I didn't couldn't continue because I had no more information. I'm not sure. I was not sure where to search for how to get to this information. So, the remaining part of this document was kind of search, gynecological search. So I had to go to some local archives in different cities. So, for example, like prisoner 20, he was born in a given location city. So I went there to get some information about him, what happened with him later. So slowly, step by step, I managed to get more and more information and create this. Um, Also, as I said before, these versions that were binding, the authors of them were former prisoners. So it turned out that it was the other way around sometimes, you know, and especially regarding, you know, the lives of Bruno Brodniewicz lives. So as I said, he he would live until 1960s in Brem. So it was hard to tell you to say what he was doing there, but I believe that he was living a calm life, a easy life, and Augustin Miller, another example, he didn't actually die during the war, as we thought before, and many other things. I managed to get to the pre-war police files, and Michal Galas, prisoner number 10, he was in the US before the war. He had been there. And so, you know, looking through these police files, pre-war files, well, it was quite interesting because it turned out that in these files, there were his letters where he would be writing to his mother, who was in Los Angeles back then, and I was asking his mother to write a letter to some consul to take him out of this camp because he was living in the camp and he would be, you know, punished there and so on and so forth. So there were a lot of letters and also, just, you know, the spinal registers. And we know based on that what life these people had, you know. Otto Kiesel, he was punished 4 times, and he was one of the people who, compared to other, that was not a very rich criminal file, not much. I think I think 200 punishments was the record. So he was punished only 4 times. So you can see what life they had before war as criminals. But prisoners would think that they were punished for, you know, harsh, you know, murders. I remember such reports, such descriptions where one of these prisoners, together with some, you know, friend, mm, would break into some shop, store. They would steal some coffee, and then they would go to the mother of one of them, and this mother would, you know, bake a cake, mokka cake. So these descriptions were kind of funny, you know, not scary. So these were the guys. These are the criminals, very like fine criminals, like, and they were punished many times for such small offenses. And what's another thing, another interesting thing is that after the war, these prisoners
chcieli się przyznać do tego, że byli
They didn't really
kapo.
want to say that
Dlatego
they were
te dwa
capos, that
podłoża
they
chorobowe
had
jest
been capos.
charakterystyczne,
Why am I
że
saying
na
it?
przykład
Because it's
rodziny
very
osób
characteristic that the families
w
of
ogóle
these
nie chcą
people, they don't want
o
to
tych
talk
sprawach
about these
rozmawiać.
issues,
Ja
anymore.
tutaj
And
nawiązałem kontakt z
I
jedną
remember I got
z
in touch
rodzin.
with one of the
W każdym
families
razie
of the capos, and
po krótkiej wymianie maili oni
after
jednak
some
oświadczyli,
emails,
że
they actually
oni absolutnie nie chcą
stated that
żadnych
they don't
informacji o
really
swoim
want
krewnym
to
udzielać,
give
tylko
any
oczywiście
information
szanowałem
about their
to,
relative. Of course, I
domyślam się,
respected that because I can assume that
jakie
this
oni mieli
information
obawy.
was not nice, and
Imię i
actually they had
nazwisko. W
some
każdym razie dodam tylko,
concerns
że
about
chodziło o
it.
więźnia, który
Let me
wcale nie
tell you
należał do
that
jednego
that
z
was a
bardziej
prisoner
brutalnych.
who was not the most
Raczej
brutal one,
są
basically.
poza niego
Actually, to be
pozytywne
honest, he had
opinie,
quite
także
positive opinions.
myślę, że oni po prostu
So I think they
nie są
didn't
tego
really want
świadomi
to. Oh, they were not
swoich krewnych.
aware
Był
of that. They
przez
thought that
4 lata
if
kapo w Auschwitz,
his
nawet
relative was a
nadupostał
couple
się
in the
tam
Auschwitz camp, probably he was very
takich
brutal. Maybe that was
strasznych czynów.
that is their
Natomiast
understanding of
no,
this situation.
to
However, it
dotyczy
was not
właściwie
really the
wszystkich
case because this prisoner was
rodzin
not the most
tych
brutal
właśnie
one.
ludzi,
But
nie,
again, the same
mimo że w
happens,
wypadku
with with
pokojów
other families. They don't really
inaczej,
want to talk
natomiast
about
reszta
their
nie sądzę,
relatives anymore. And
żeby chciała w ogóle o tym rozmawiać. To myślę, że
well,
pokrótce, no starałem się jakoś tak w
I was
wielkim
trying
skrócie
to
przedstawić
tell
tę
you all this
charakterystykę
information very briefly,
tych
this
więźniów.
characteristics of these prisoners.
I myślę, że to
And I believe
na
that
chwilę obecną
at
wystarczy.
this point this is enough. Thank you.
Panie Andrzeju, bardzo
Andrzej,
dziękuję za wykład. Tak jak
sir,
pan
thank you for this
powiedział,
lecture. As
wokół
you said,
pierwszych niemieckich więźniów funkcyjnych Auschwitz
regarding the
narosło
first
sporo
German
mitów,
functionary
legend
prisoners, a
i
lot
pan
of
właśnie
myths,
wiele z
a lot
nich
of
w swojej
legends, and
książce
it's
obala.
good that you are,
No właśnie
telling the
ten mit,
truth in your
że ci
book.
więźniowie
A myth that
trafili tu
these
raczej do
prisoners
Auschwitz ze
came
względu
to the
na
Auschwitz
kwalifikacje zawodowe,
camp
jakie
due to their
niewątpliwie były
professional
potrzebne przy
qualifications that
organizacji
were, of
tego
course,
obozu, a
needed
nie
to
dlatego, że to
organize the
więźniowie
camp, and
wyrażali
not
takiego
because they
wielkiego
were
kalibru.
criminals before the
Z
war.
tych
And
30
based on this
pierwszych
30,
funkcyjnych wojnę przeżyło 19.
19
I
of
już
these
pan powiedział,
31
właśnie tylko
functionaries actually
3
survived,
poniosło
and 3 of
odpowiedzialność
them actually
karną za te czyny dokonane w
received
Auschwitz. Proszę
punishment.
Państwa, książka jest
3 of them. Well,
ciekawa,
the book
jest
is very
wynikiem
interesting, by the way.
wieloletnich
It's the result of
szczegółowych
many
badań
years, very
opartych na
detailed
materiałach z archiwów
analysis
polskich i
that is
niemieckich,
based on
także
Polish,
zachęcam,
German
żeby Pani o
archives.
tym
So
sięgnąć.
I recommend this book to you.
Nasz webinar
And
powoli
our
dobiega końca.
webinar is coming
Ja zapraszam
to an
na
end.
kolejny,
I
który
would like to
będzie
invite you
17
to the next
czerwca.
one on the
Będzie on
7th of
poświęcony
June,
pierwszym Polakom
which will be devoted to
deportowanym
the
do
first
kampa
Poles
Auschwitz.
deported to Auschwitz.
W tym momencie
And at
bardzo
this point,
dziękuję
thank
wykładowcom,
you to
dziękuję Państwu
lecturers,
za to,
thank you
że
to you
połączyliście się z nami.
for joining
Do
us,
zobaczenia.
and let's see you next time.